Hello and welcome to our video review of the docu-series Cooked, hosted by myself, Michael Kerrigan, Christian Barton, Cassidy Welch, and Shaylin Sherrill. Now, this docu-series is a 4-part docu-series that go over 4 elements in our cooked foods. We have earth, fire, water, and air, kind of like the Avatar, just to make it a little bit easier. Each episode goes in depth on each connection with the element in its food, not only with the taste, but also with the culture. From thousands of bacteria living in your food to how it's prepared, this docu-series has it all. And to go into the first episode of Fire, I'm going to hand it over to Christian to give you a little bit more interesting details.
Cook's first episode, that being titled Fire, we are first presented to the image of the Martu people hunting for various animals for eating. From there, we are introduced to this idea that fire is quintessential to the aspect of our becoming human. This idea is introduced by the docuseries narrator and researcher and acclaimed food author Michael Pollan. Throughout the rest of the episode, Michael explores different historical implications to fire and its relation to food by interviewing anthropologists. In addition, Michael also dives deep into the social implications of fire and food by discussing the idea of corporations making our food, as well as the idea of gender in cooking. The main argument that Michael presents for this episode is the idea that we as a society live in a time where we may have forgotten and may have lost our way when it comes to cooking our foods in more traditional manners. He argues that the industrialization of food has been a big factor that has resulted in this collapse of traditional cooking we have long forgotten. To support this argument, Michael uses a variety of rhetorical appeal to convey his message to his audience, that audience being those that are familiarized with elementary level knowledge about topics like anthropology, politics, sociology, and the food industry as a whole. Images of the Martu people hunting and cooking lizards, as well as pigs in dire dystopian looking industrial settings, makes the audience feel empathetic towards the points that Michael argues. Michael also supports his arguments through his effective use of logical appeals. His inclusion of individuals like anthropologists and grill masters all give credence to the logical soundness of Michael's arguments, while simultaneously lending his arguments to a certain level of credibility as well. Overall, I felt that Fire was able to accomplish its purpose of informing the audience about the many different socio-political and historical implications that fire has on our everyday lives. Michael's effective use of rhetorical appeals creates strong support for his argument that we live in a society that has lost touch with our ancestral ways of creating and preparing our meals. The scope of his argument was not too broad such that it would have confused the audience, but also was not too narrowed of a scope such that we got too little information about fire and our relation to it. This episode truly did leave a strong impact on the way that I perceive not just fire, but the way that I prepare my meals and food each and every day.
In the second episode of Cooked, titled Water, Michael Pollan discovers cooking in pots and the use of water to develop flavors. This episode takes us to India, one of the last places where home-cooked meals have remained the main source of nourishment. This episode explains the transition from exclusively home-cooked meals to a culture that outsources most of our meals from pre-made or takeout. Pollan says cooking has always been a part of his life, though he rarely had time for cooking. For him, cooking with water represents the stews which his mother used to make. Nowadays, cultures are finding it difficult to spend time in the kitchen. He asks us how we got to this point and looks at what we've lost in the process. The main argument of this episode is that we have grown away from spending time in the kitchen preparing and making meals. We learned that economist David Cutler discovered that as the amount of time we spend cooking and preparing meals goes down, the amount of obesity goes up. It is mentioned that if we are going to rebuild a culture of cooking, not only do we need to learn our way around the kitchen and learn the joy and the time it takes to make food well, but what we really need to do is bring our kids into the kitchen with us. I felt that this episode really explained its purpose well. It showed us how we have lost the time and the culture that cooking entails, and it effectively used rhetorical strategies to inform the audience of why cooking is so important and how we've lost that culture with the decreasing amount of time we spend in the kitchen. I really felt that this episode showed me what cooking with water really means and how important cooking and spending time in the kitchen is over deciding to make pre-made or takeout food.
In this episode, Michael Pollan visits different food labs in Moroccan fields. Throughout this episode, he talks about the relationship between humans and wheat, along with the importance of air. He starts the episode off by talking about how air is considered the key ingredient when making bread and other wheat products.
It's such a simple food. It's like 3 ingredients.
Throughout the episode, key points are brought up, such as bread being translated to the word of life in many different languages, the history of bread, along with the shortages of wheat and the political turmoil that comes along with that. Another point is brought up in the episode that nearly 30% of Americans try to avoid eating gluten when there isn't much scientific data to prove that gluten is actually bad for you. Only 1 to 2% of people are actually allergic to gluten and cannot consume it. We live in a time where the new normal is cooking with microwaves and ovens. To counteract this point, Michael describes the purpose, which is to inform the audience of the historical implications of bread and its long-lasting effects on society at large. When looking at the intended audience for this episode, I would say it would range from young adult to the elderly. I personally feel like the younger generations and younger audiences wouldn't be able to appreciate what is being said here. The scope of the episode is very large and broad. Michael Pollan went as far as India to conduct his research, and he even conducted local research in the form of his own baking.
I don't know if there's another food I like quite as much as bread, I have to say.
The main argument of this episode is that we, as a society, have forgotten how to make our own food. We have become accustomed to the simple and easy ways of making food. All 3 of the appeals can be found in this episode. For example, ethos, he used his primary resources, like the people from India. For pathos, he talks about the negative historical sides of bread and how it has affected society. And for logos, he goes through step by step explaining why bread is important to our culture and how it's made, starting with air. I found this episode the most interesting out of the 4. Personally, I really love to bake, and seeing how air is worked into bread and other baked goods is really interesting. Also, learning about the wheat and how it affects how we live and the basis of life is really captivating. Overall, this episode used all of the rhetorical appeals in a good way, and that really gets the point across to the audience in an effective way.
Hello again, everyone. I'm back, and I was blessed to have the Earth episode of the docu-series from Cooked, and I learned a lot watching the episode, not just how Earth provides an enhanced flavor and fights off bacteria from its natural minerals, but also how it's kind of a cultural identity around the globe with how people prepare their food and how it's been passed on from generation to generation. And we see that through examples in the episode where nuns are making wheels of cheese and people are harvesting chocolate from cocoa plants, and when it starts off it's a squid-like substance and it takes days, weeks to do the fermenting process and actually make the food that is supposed to come out. And it was pretty crazy, some of the concoctions that you saw. They gave examples in the episode of TV shows like Bizarre Foods or Anthony Bourdain No Reservations or Gordon Ramsay shows too, and they would try out weird cuisines, like disgusting ones. 100-year-old tofu salad, bull's testicles, and all this sounds disgusting, which to me I think it is, but it's natural cuisines for that culture. It's what they've always had and what they're used to. And this episode definitely taught me to try out new foods. Even if it seems disgusting, you should at least give it a try, because you're really dipping your tongue into someone's culture and you get to taste all the spices, it's amazing. I'd strongly recommend watching this little docu-series. But it gives great examples of how the process is made. From when we go to the ranch where the nuns are at and we have Sister Noel, this isn't just some random nun. You know, she has a doctorate in microbiology and she's been working with this recipe making wheels of cheese, kind of like the French way. And it's such a delicate process, and people will come by and try to tinker with the process in the episode too. So long story short, she's making milk with a wooden barrel, and the bacteria are actually fighting off what would happen with E. coli, but end up having an E. coli outbreak because they had to switch the wooden barrels to stainless steel, because everyone thinks stainless steel is cleaner, safer. But in this process, Earth wins. You see cuisines all around, from in the forest getting cocoa plants to nuns making wheels of cheese to even Michael Pollan and his son talking about making beer. It really is a delicate balance, and it goes to show how far we've come from having processed foods and all these other things that are actually hurting our bodies when we should just be taking in earth naturally. If there's one thing you get from this episode is earth. You gotta use earth in everything you do.
All in all, Cooked is an excellent docu-series that is perfect for any young adult, older adult, culinary expert, and any foodie. The entire documentary's use of rhetorical appeals is effectively carried out through its fantastic and varied use of imagery, interviews, historical dialogues, and comments on many different socio-economic and socio-political aspects about our favorite foods. Michael Pollan's use of the 4 elements of earth, water, fire, and air is a creative analogy to talk about many different aspects of our food that we do not think about. This documentary is not for the faint of heart, however, as its complex use of vocabulary and its nearly 4-hour runtime makes it a harder documentary to access when compared to others in its similar genres. Besides that, we totally recommend that you take a look at Cooked, as it truly opened our eyes to the many different political, social, historical, and culinary aspects food has in store.